This is called The American Empire: Delusion, Denial, Deception. I'm a psychologist, a professor from California, and there was a poll done of Americans asking them, or should America be an empire? 90% of the respondents said no. But the more important question was, is America an empire? And of those, 40% said no. Now, denial is a psychological defense mechanism. It means that you're living in a dream world, you're not looking at reality, you're living out some kind of delusion. So there's a pundit named Lawrence Vance. He's written 20 books, he's head of a think tank. He says the American empire is the largest empire ever to have existed on this planet, bigger than the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire. So either Lawrence Vance is out of his mind, or 40% of the American people are living in a fantasy land, on Fantasy Island. So that's the kind of the intent of today's investigation. Now, I wrote a book. It's called Duped: Delusion, Denial, and the End of the American Dream. And in that book, I talk about 6 major delusions that Americans face. Now, a delusion for an individual person is a crazy theory that you have about the world, a nutty idea. And if you act out on that delusion, you're one step closer to mental illness. Now, in collective psychology, nations also suffer from delusions. At one time, 60% of the American people believed Saddam Hussein was making nuclear weapons or developing them. And we acted on that delusion, and we killed thousands of people based on a false idea. So we're going to look now at this notion that America is not an empire or it is an empire, and just what does that mean? And I think this discussion starts with Bob Hope. Now, if you're not that young, you remember who he is. He was a very famous American comedian, and every Christmas Bob Hope was going to entertain our troops. He was having after the Vietnam War, before the Korean 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, Bob Hope was gone every Christmas entertaining our troops. And you had to ask, why do we always have troops somewhere? Why are the troops always at war? So this is just a short refresher for you.
From Saigon, Long Binh, Bearcat, Da Nang, Cu Chi, Pleiku, Lai Kay, Chu Lai, Phu Quoc, Van Rang, and Cam Bay in Vietnam. From Guam, Wake Island, and Clark Field in the Philippines. From the USS Ranger and the USS Coral Sea on Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin. And from Korat, U Dorn, Tak Lee, U Ban, Nakhon Phanom, and Bangkok, Thailand. The Bob Hope Christmas Special.
So one place to begin is to look at how many places Bob Hope had the chance to visit. The U.S. military intervention since World War II. This research was staggering for me. It was just beyond belief. We have somehow had over 55 military interventions since World War II. Greece, Germany, the Philippines. There was a rebellion on in the Philippines, and the CIA directed forces against it. Puerto Rico wanted to become independent in 1950. We crushed that. In Iran, they elected a leader who was a Democrat and a liberal, and we thought he might take away our oil interests. So we supported the Shah's taking over, the overthrow of that government, and the Shah was basically thought of himself as a king and ruled for decades. And part of our problems with Iran today are the fact that we supported this monarch, despot. Guatemala in 1954 elected a government that we thought might threaten our economic interests, and the CIA started an invasion of that country and overthrew the country, overthrew the government of our bonds. Here's a little.
Guatemala, 1954. The United States intervened unilaterally to protect its vital interests. Lebanon, 1958. The United States feels its policy of containment in the Middle East is threatened. Responds openly and unilaterally. The United States intervened in Laos, the Congo, Brazil.
There are so many theories about what happened in Iraq and why we really went in, but when you look at the history of the United States, almost every president, there is something we don't like somewhere in the world, and we've got to dispense military force.
Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada in 1983.
Last night I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama.
This is not about one president or one party. We fight as a nation because we perceive it is in our interest to fight. And we then mention words like freedom and nice common values that who can be against freedom, when in fact much more has been going on privately.
So we continue with this litany. Panama, 1958. Cuba nationalized our interests. We invaded unsuccessfully. Panama again, 1964. The Dominican Republic similarly had elections which put in power a government we didn't like. The Marines landed in 65, 66. Nicaragua, Honduras, Grenada, Libya, Bolivia, Iran again, Panama again in 1989, Oman and Chile in 1973. Salvador Allende's democratic left-leaning government threatened our copper interests, and he was overthrown, and Augusto Pinochet was put in his place. He was a military dictator who Spain tried to indict for war crimes, but we were his ally and supporter. El Salvador, Haiti, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, the list continues and continues and continues. This is a short video summarizing all of our interventions. So that takes you up through 2009, but that's not the end of the story. In the last 2 years, 2011 to 2012, under our Barack Obama, the United States was killing people in 9 different countries. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Yemen with drones, Somalia with drones, Pakistan with drones, Libya with missiles, Honduras, we landed in Honduras with Marines and as part of the war on drugs. The Philippines, we helped crush some what we called terrorists down there, and we just landed some special forces troops in Kenya. So no other country in the world is involved militarily in actions that China, Russia, nothing even comes close to what we've been doing. Media talks about these things in a rather distorted way. Not that there's a conspiracy as much as an unconscious conspiracy. It's easier to have people watch the news and buy Wheaties or Chevrolets that are sponsoring the news if those stories have some psychological relevance if they're stories about us. If they're stories about people who are not us, that's less interesting often. To talk about us versus them, us always seems to win out. For example, here comes Diane Sawyer interviewing a soldier about his experiences in Iraq. She asks him questions about his family, how difficult it was, what of a sacrifice his family made and he made. One question she never asks him, officer or sir, how many people would you estimate that you killed on your last tour of duty? 10, 15, 20? That's a question that just is completely inappropriate. It doesn't get asked. If you look at our newspapers, you read in the New York Times, so many Americans have died, 2,028 in Afghanistan. It's always there every single day. But the number of people we killed is just missing. It's not there. So we talk about our sacrifices, our soldiers, our bereaved widows, how difficult it is for military families, how much courage in supporting our troops, that the nation rallies around our troops. But we don't talk about the consequences of our behavior. Noam Chomsky says that the slogan, the public relations slogan, support your troops, is a kind of diversion that prevents us from discussing whether we support the issue at any particular war that we're involved in. So there was a question that was asked of college students in Boston. These are smart kids. They have high SAT scores. Ivy League college. They're asked, how many Vietnamese casualties were there during the Vietnam War? Okay, what do college students who are an educated group, how do they answer that? Their average answer was 100,000. That's what they thought. They thought 100,000 Vietnamese died in the Vietnam War. The answer is 3 million. Okay? How could they be that wrong? We killed 3 million people in Vietnam, and they think we killed 100,000. That's a huge margin of error. And you have to ask, how could smart people be that stupid? Okay? So the answer is in the fact that if you go to a place called the Vanderbilt Television Archives, you can look up every prime-time newscast for decades. CNN, ABC, NBC, all of that. And you can search. So if you search for Vietnamese casualties versus U.S. casualties, the stories about U.S. casualties outnumber Vietnamese casualties at least 4 to 1. But the actual reality is, for every American that died, 56 Vietnamese died. That is a huge cognitive dissonance there. The input that is coming from the media is distorted, okay? It's completely distorted in favor of stories about us and not stories about the consequences of our actions. And therefore, college students would think, well, I guess we didn't kill that many people. So during the Vietnam War, again, our coverage was about ourselves, our missing in action, our POWs, our soldiers who were injured or killed, and it was very little about the other side. We don't have any names of people who died as a consequence of our actions there. So here's a piece of Vietnam news coverage that really illustrates this point.
This is Pleiku, 250 miles north of Saigon, the air base that was ripped by Vietnamese communist guerrillas. 8 Americans died in the attack that brought swift retaliation by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. From carriers and land bases, 49 jets struck back at staging areas just across the border in North Vietnam. The Red Guerrillas were able to slip by Vietnamese guards in the middle of the night raid and lob mortar shells into the area, while hand-carried bombs were placed under aircraft and against barrack walls. Why security was so lax is the object of 2 investigations, although some officers say full protection against such attacks is impossible in this jungle war. There is mute evidence of the toll the guerrillas took here.
Now notice that this coverage focuses in on, obviously, a soldier's daughter. She lost her dad, one of the 8 Americans who was killed. You don't see photographs of a Vietnamese Viet Cong who was killed and photographs of his wife and family and children displayed on these newsreels. Okay, so it's obviously centered on America and on our soldiers, but the cumulative effect is that it distorts our perception of the world, as testimony by those students who were asked how many Vietnamese died. But we learned a little more.
After the fight at LZ X-Ray, the Chu Pong was bombed by almost 100 B-52s, each unloading 17 tons of high explosives.
Now, when we bombed Cambodia, which was a very short period of time, we actually dropped more bombs on Cambodia than we dropped in World War II. And it said there at the bottom of that film clip that we dropped the equivalent of 5 Hiroshima-sized bombs around a certain area of Vietnam. So this was not reported in terms of the amount of casualties that we created in that war. So if you really want to have your heart broken, here is a table that lists the number of people that we killed since World War II. And that number, all these are referenced in my book. And it's not that difficult to reference, okay? I'm not putting all my footnotes out here because they're like 150 and it's going to just confuse your screen. But it's all there. Now, the number comes out to 5 million people that the United States killed since World War II. That's hard to get your mind around. Now, to be honest here, in Guatemala, the CIA trained and helped train the right-wing death squads of Guatemala, and they're the ones who killed 200,000 people. President Clinton went to Guatemala and apologized, but we actually didn't kill those people. They did. Our trainees did. In Indonesia, we supported a coup against a progressive leader and put this military man, Suharto, in his place. He killed 700,000 people. He was our surrogate, but we didn't do those killings. So if you just talk about people that we ourselves killed, it's about 4 million. If we include our surrogates, it's 5 million. Okay? Strangely enough, there were 53,000 Americans who died in Vietnam, but more people have, twice that number of people died since we left Vietnam because of unexploded munitions and cluster bombs left in Laos, and 100,000 people have died by stepping on cluster bombs in the last 40 or 50 years. So, now on top of that, the United States has been involved in all sorts of assassination attempts, many of which failed, but the list of people that the United States tried to assassinate is incredible. Patrice Lumumba came to power in the Congo. We didn't like him, and so we participated in his assassination. We even tried to kill Charles de Gaulle, according to one author. Raul Castro, Fidel Castro, 8 attempts, both of Saddam Hussein's sons, Salvador Allende. Well, that was supposed to be a suicide, but there are a lot of people who think that it wasn't. So that's the list of U.S.-sponsored assassinations since World War II. Now, what's going on here? Are we fighting for freedom and liberty, or are we fighting to expand our empire? Is that, it seems as if you look at these interventions objectively, you say, are we fighting for freedom? I mean, after all, we took out this democratic leader and we put in the military junta. That doesn't seem like we're standing for the values that we espouse to our people. Let's take a case study. The original invasion of remember when Saddam Hussein attacked and took over Kuwait, and then we liberated Kuwait? Do you remember that story? Well, at the time, he had invaded Kuwait. This is under George Bush Sr. And Republicans said, we got to go and liberate Kuwait and get that back. And Democrats were waffling. They weren't quite sure they wanted to go to war. And George Bush Sr. could not get all the support he needed. So all of a sudden, a young 15-year-old girl named Naira comes to testify. She says, I can't use my last name because I might be endangering myself, but I'd like to testify. She cries, and she says that when she was in Kuwait, the Iraqi soldiers came to the hospital, took the babies out of the incubators, threw them on the floor, and took the incubators back to Iraq. And that story just, that did it. That enraged the American people. It enraged Congress, and we decided to give the president authorization to go to war.
Kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
Except that Naira was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. They say the story about the incubators was totally false. She was coached by Hill and Knowlton, a public relations firm. The Kuwaiti monarchy, the rich Kuwaitis, were trying to do everything they could to get America to go and liberate Kuwait. They didn't want to lose all of their wealth. This is a guy named Barry Zwicker.
U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq. But polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers coming to the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths. Not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill and Knowlton. It's one phase in a...
So with all of that, the United States organizes its troops and gets ready to invade Kuwait and starts a bombing campaign. And so first we have George Bush discussing how he explains this to the American people.
The liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission. Tonight, as this coalition of countries seeks to do that which is right and just, I ask only that all of you stop what you are doing and say a prayer for all the coalition forces, and especially for our men and women in uniform, who this very moment are risking their lives for their country and for all of us. May God bless and protect each and every one of them, and may God bless the United States.
So as we invade, hordes of Iraqis leave Kuwait in cars and buses and school buses, and they're bombed relentlessly on what they call now the highway of death.
On the night of February 26th, 41 days after war began, planes and helicopters attacked thousands of Iraqis fleeing Kuwait, soldiers and civilians. The bombing began at midnight and continued for hours. There was no escape. Pool reporters filmed the aftermath. Over 60 miles of highway, littered with thousands of cars, buses, trucks, and a handful of tanks. The bodies were never counted. Charges of war crimes were brought against the United States.
So now it was described as the liberation of Kuwait. So, and George Bush, of course, referred to Saddam Hussein as the butcher of Baghdad. But the media always focused on the evil Saddam Hussein. They really didn't say we were fighting against him, but what were we fighting for? It was sort of implied. It was implied that we were fighting for freedom and the liberation of Kuwait. It was like, okay, let's reestablish a nice democracy that we can believe in and stand behind. Is that why American troops are giving their lives? Well, that's not true. What we fought for was His Highness, the Emir Jaber III Al-Ahmad Al-Jaber Al-Sabah. He was the hereditary monarch of Kuwait. He got that job from his father, who got it from his father, all the way back to the 18th century. Women did not play any role in the Kuwaiti government. Women did not have a right to vote. We were fighting to bring back the 30th richest man in the world to his villas. He wasn't, the media never talked about him. Okay, he stayed in a very fancy resort in Saudi Arabia during the whole war, and he wouldn't come back even after they won because he said he wants all of his chandeliers in his castle to be back before he comes. He spent most of the war in Saudi Arabia and gambling in Monaco. Now, his sister describes him as a religious man. She said he followed Islamic law, which said you're only allowed to have 4 wives. So he got around that by divorcing his 4th wife and kind of recycling the 4th wife. He would marry a girl on Friday and divorce her on the following Wednesday. And if he liked her, she'd get a car. If he really liked her, he'd stay married to her for 2 or 3 weeks, and then she'd get a car and a condo. Then he'd divorce her and marry another girl. That's how he did it. He was, that was his system, okay, of staying within Islamic law. And that is what America fought for. Kuwait controls 1/5 of the world's oil supply. And when we went to war to liberate Kuwait, we went to reclaim our interests in 1/5 of the world's oil and to put in power this Arab monarch. And the sad thing is here that 19 American women died in this war. 19 American women gave their lives to bring back an all-male monarchy that did not allow women to vote. And you wonder, if they knew that, would they have resigned their commissions before they lost their lives? I wonder what they thought they were fighting for. But this is certainly kind of like the hidden agenda of that war. So, when we're building our empire and trying to reclaim 1/5 of the world's oil supply and saying that we're doing this for freedom and democracy, we create a delusory system in the minds of Americans. Here was the head of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev. They have one name. This guy has one name. Cheney went to visit him. We think that we're representing democracy and freedom and American values. He put his arms around him, shook his hand, talked about how earlier times they had been together. Nazarbayev, there wasn't very much democracy in Kazakhstan. 2 guys were trying to run against Nazarbayev in a kind of a funny little election. But unfortunately, both of them were shot in the back of the head. I wonder who did that. Well, Cheney was meeting with the leading suspect who had his two opponents whacked and cementing great relations with Kazakhstan. Niyazov, another guy who only has one name like Cher, was the president for life of Turkmenistan, a Stalinist. No democracy here, okay? He was so taken by himself that he had all of the months of the calendar renamed after his family. So February was named after his mother. He changed the name of all the months, and all the children in Turkmenistan had to memorize the new months of the year, which were names of the members of his family. Cheney met him, shook his hand, said, okay, brothers in arms here. Okay, we were interested in their gas and in their oil and not in their politics or democracy, and we could have cared less. With respect to Saudi Arabia, obviously, as you can see, our relationships are close, but we talk about regime change. Why wouldn't we think about that in Saudi Arabia? Their record with women, as you well know, is appalling. Women, it's the only country in the world where women are not allowed to drive. When a woman goes out of the house, she has to be in the company of some kind of a male relative. There was a 75-year-old woman who had her nephews in law bring her some bread, and she had to be flogged because they were not close enough blood relationships to her for her to be justifying that trip to get bread. There are women in Saudi Arabia who don't know how old they are because for many years women did not get birth certificates. So the record for America in its dealings with other countries, it's obvious that what we're doing is following our economic interests and the interests of our empire, and not the values of freedom and democracy, which are so heavily touted in the media. Now, the United States has also had a very, very long relationship with despots and military juntas and dictators. And if you look at the history of this, American people tend to think that America supports the values of democracy and freedom. But when you look at our international relationships, we get a very different picture. These are some of the dictators that we've loved, supported, and were our allies. Idi Amin in Uganda, mentally ill, killed between 80,000 and 300,000 people in his own country. He was our ally. Botha in apartheid South Africa was our ally. Chiang Kai-shek, our ally. And I'm sorry, and No Dinh Diem in Vietnam, Papa Doc Duvalier, also a strange, a crazy despot. Francisco, excuse me, Generalissimo Francisco Franco ruled Spain with an iron hand for 37 years. Richard Nixon said General Franco was a loyal friend and ally of the United States. He was also an ally of Hitler in World War II, and he was a dictator. We were not working at regime change there. Again, the Shah of Iran, George Papadopoulos, who overthrew the government of Greece. The list continues. Probably our most embarrassing one is Suharto, who overthrew the left-leaning government in Indonesia and really killed approximately 700,000 of his own people in East Timor and in Indonesia. So this list is really unhappy and embarrassing, frankly. So why do we have this history of relationships with dictators and military juntas, and such a meager relationship with democracies that emerge in the third world? Well, I don't have an answer to that question, except it seems to be that we are engaged in the process of empire building. So you think, well, oh, maybe that's a Republican thing. It isn't. Here's President Obama. Clinton did it too, but Obama is schmoozing with Ali Bongo. Who's Ali Bongo? He is the military leader of Gabon in Africa. 30% of his country lives on less than $2 a day. But he has a $24 million mansion in Paris, a personal fortune of over $130 million. He's been accused of systematically looting the country. His regime is ruled with an iron fist. He's accused of violence against women, the ritualistic killing of pygmies, the systematic looting of the country, and there he is schmoozing with Obama. Why? This guy is not consistent with American values at all. But he has minerals and things that we want, and so we are. He has a nice meeting with the president, and I'm sure has lots of photographs now in his mansion in Paris showing the two of them shaking hands and having a laugh together. This is what John F. Kennedy said in 1960. It is absolutely true today, but this is what he said in 1960. I'm going to read it to you. In 1953, the dictator of Peru was given a medal by the United States. The dictator of Venezuela was awarded the Legion of Merit by our ambassador. In 1955, our Secretary of the Navy went to Argentina and made an eloquent address comparing dictator Perón to Lincoln to Perón's advantage. In 1956, the dictator of Paraguay received his medal from America. We have warmly embraced Trujillo, the brutal despot of the Dominican Republic. We've dumped more than $500 million worth of arms and ammunition into Latin America over the past 8 years, much of which has been used to strengthen the hand of dictatorships. So, what has changed since the times of Kennedy? If we're putting our arms around the head of Kazakhstan, who just whacked his two opponents, we have to ask, why are we doing this? And what is the purpose of all of this? Are the American people being duped progressively and systematically with respect to our role in the world? Now, the military side of our empire is just astonishing. These are the countries where the United States has troops or military personnel. Over 130 countries, 70% of the planet takes American troops, has American bases or American military personnel or arrangements with the United States. That's 70% of planet Earth. And still, 40% of our population says we do not have an empire. These are just the military bases of the United States in the Middle East. Every little star there is a military base. We've got the whole area covered. Okay? It is estimated that the United States has over 1,000 military bases, slightly less than 1,000 military bases outside of our country. Take a look at that picture. That is a satellite map of the Indian Ocean. Okay? In the very center of the Indian Ocean is a place called Diego Garcia. There's an island. We have a military base there. And you could ask, why would we have a military base in the center of the Indian Ocean? Okay? Why is there a base there with American soldiers and PXs and Wheaties that you can buy in the canteen? Why do we have a military base there? Are we patrolling the Indian Ocean? And why would the United States be patrolling? Are we there to defend India? It's hundreds of miles from India, hundreds of miles from Africa. What are we doing there? Do we want to have, maybe we have long-range bombers there, and the reason we have a base is so that we can extend our reach and be able to bomb any place on Earth that we choose. That base is 9,300 miles from our shores. Is that base there because we are protecting America or because we are monitoring and policing our empire? That's a question to consider. This is a picture of a naval armada with an aircraft carrier. We have 11 aircraft carriers. China is just building its first. When you look at all the armaments that the United States has, our military budget, our missiles, our reach across this planet, it is absolutely staggering. We are now developing a weapon called a hypersonic weapon. It's already been successfully tested. This weapon can travel about 4,000 miles an hour. It can bomb any place on Earth with incredible accuracy within an hour. So we have just about achieved the capability of bombing any place on Earth within 60 minutes. Why does the nation of the United States need that capability? The empire of the United States might need that capability, but the country of the United States, why would it need to be able to bomb any place on Earth within an hour? So I want to try you a guided fantasy. In psychology, a guided fantasy sometimes shakes up your mind a little bit and allows you new information to come through. So there may be people out there who resent the theme of what is going on here. And I would like to follow this fantasy out because I think it illustrates what we're talking about here. Let's pretend, okay? Imagine that you wake up in the morning and you see that the president of China has just shaken hands with the president of Mexico, and they have agreed to build a large Chinese military base in Baja California. Okay, it will house aircraft carriers, submarines, and troops. And it's a new bilateral relationship. And the Chinese say to the Americans, "Don't worry, we're just upgrading our Pacific presence." Oh, really? Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, they're going to become apoplectic. China is going to have a military base in our hemisphere? Give me a break. That's not acceptable. They're going to have an aircraft carrier 12 miles off the coast of Los Angeles and have spy planes listening to email and telecommunications in San Francisco up and down the California coast? Unacceptable. Even if it's in international waters, totally unacceptable. Then you wake up, and a month later, China has just signed a new agreement in Honduras that they are going to have a base in the Caribbean. They say, we're going to just upgrade our Caribbean presence. Shouldn't be threatened by that. We have a number of relationships with Caribbean countries, and we want to have a base there. And again, Americans are going crazy that they are going to have ships and planes and troops and be able to threaten Florida. Finally, you read another article that the Chinese have decided, with the cooperation of the government of the Bahamas, to build a new military base in New Providence, which is right near Nassau. It's 175 miles from Florida. It's a $1 billion base, and it's going to house 20 warships. And again, our media is going to go crazy. We should break off relations with Mexico, break off relations with the Bahamas. We should quarantine the area and not let these ships in. After all, it's just like what the Soviets tried to do with Cuba a generation ago. We cannot allow this to happen. Again, they'll have ships 12 miles off the coast of Washington, D.C. and New York City listening to our communications. We cannot allow that to happen. Are you following this crazy thought? Well, this is not even close to reality. Agreed? Fine. Now let's come back to reality from our guided fantasy. Okay? This is a map of China. All right? And those little black planes are American military bases. We have 2 military bases on China's eastern coast. We have 4 military bases in China's southern region, and we have 4 military bases on the west section of China. We have 10 military bases surrounding China. We do to them all the time what we would never accept them doing to us. Okay, we actually do have. We're building a base in South Korea now that is a $1 billion base, which will house 20 warships, just like they were going to build in the Bahamas. It's 187 miles from the Chinese border. And we're building a $1 billion base. And we'd say we're just upgrading our Pacific presence. The Chinese should not be threatened by what we're doing. So what we're doing to China, we would never accept for China doing to us. It's just out of the question. There's China's one aircraft carrier, and it doesn't have any aircraft on it yet. They're just building it. So if you look at the United States reach with our 900 and some odd military bases, compare that to Russia. Russia has 10 overseas military bases, and almost all of them are in the former Soviet Union, like in the Ukraine. China doesn't have any overseas military bases. They're thinking of building one. Okay? How do we explain that except to say that it is the American empire that has this incredible planetary reach, not simply our country. If you look at military expenditures of all the countries in the world, the United States makes up 43%. A few years ago it was 48%. All the other countries in the world, and our military budget is about almost equal to what everybody else spends. Now, what is the consequence of having an empire like this that extends to 70% of the planet? Well, this is a map of consumption. The countries in red consume the most. So you can see who's the king of the castle here in this display. The United States of America consumes the most on this planet. That is to say, we are the largest consumer of natural resources. We're only 4.5% of the population of the world, but we consume more natural resources than anybody else. We consume 3 times more than the global average consumption of meat. The United States consumes twice as much paper as a European does, as Europe does. We burn more gasoline than the next 20 countries combined. And we consume more cereal, grain, and rice than India, which has 3 times our population. So, in the meantime, while this empire is building and we are consuming and aggrandizing ourselves, 1 in 6 people on this planet lives in a slum. 1 in 6 people on this planet lives on less than $1 a day. The UN definition of absolute poverty means living on less than $2 a day, and that includes half the human race. So, the question to ask here is this empire for you? Are they doing this for you, for us, for the average American? Are we, we ought to be happy that they're doing all that for us. Well, that's not really true. The number of millionaires in the United States has increased 20% in the last 5 years. There are 408 American billionaires in 2012. We're talking about this empire is not really meant for us. You're kind of just a bystander to it. The 400 richest Americans have more wealth than half the American population. Okay? We're talking about an upper crust elite that seems to be behind this empire. The 450 richest Americans have a combined net worth greater than the entire gross domestic product of the continent of Africa. It's staggering how much wealth has been accumulated. So, one question to ask, let's have another guided fantasy. What if there was no empire? After all, 90% of the polled Americans said they don't want to have an empire. What if we didn't have an empire? What would it look like if there was no American empire? So if you include the military budget of the Veterans Administration and retirement benefits, it comes out to be at $902 billion. All right? Now, that's almost 60% of all the revenue collected in the United States goes towards the empire. So what would happen if we made a national decision not to have an empire? What if we said, okay, we're going to put an end to this empire, and our budget we'll have twice as much as Russia, but we will take Russia's budget and China's budget, and that's how much we'll spend on defense. So that we're spending more than the Chinese, more than the Russians, and we'll take care of our veterans. And that's all we're going to do. We're not going to have 1,000 military bases. across this planet. We're going to just defend our own country and make sure that we're better than the Russians. After all, Mitt Romney said the Russians were the greatest geopolitical threat. So what if we had a military budget that was twice what the Russians' budget is and China's? That would mean that our budget would be $339 billion, not $902 billion. Okay? Are you following? We're taking Russia's budget, China's budget, adding VA benefits, and that's how much we spend for defense. This is another fantasy. Okay, so go along with this. $563 billion is saved every year. Now, what would you do with $563 billion? This is a shift in paradigm, okay? A shift in thinking. We could start helping the homeless, and we could close the Pentagon's 240 golf courses. Really, the Pentagon operates 240 golf courses. So what if we did say, okay, the empire's over. We're going to start taking care of Americans. How would you spend $563 billion per year? Follow this out. This is kind of fun. There are 20 million students who go to college in the United States. It is one study says that the average fee, the average cost of a 1 year of college in a 4-year public college is $12,000 a year. What if we gave every student who qualified, who is admitted to college, junior college, private, whatever, a $12,000 scholarship? That's a free college education. That would cost $240 billion. And you say, oh, that's a nanny state, socialism, communism. No. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Brazil, Greece, Argentina, they all have free college education for their students. It could happen. They're not socialist, communist countries. It could happen with a change in paradigm, a change in attitude. There are 40 million Americans who live below the poverty line, 20 million who live in extreme poverty, which is $2 a day. If every single person, man, woman, and child, who fits that description got a check for $7,000, first of all, there would be no extreme poverty in the United States of America. Secondly, the amount of poverty in this country would be cut by about 70%. That would cost $280 billion per year. What a difference in attitude. But there's more. There are 3.5 million homeless people in the United States living out in the streets. 70% of them are poor. 30% of them are mentally ill. It has been argued that if you gave every person a voucher for $610, they could go and get themselves a room. They could rent an apartment. They could rent a room. They'd get off the streets. Now, the mentally ill homeless cannot live independently. It costs $12,000 a year to deal with their more specific issues. But for $34 billion a year, this country could eliminate homelessness. Okay? So, we have followed out a fantasy in which we are making America simply defend itself, not all of our economic interests of the elite class. And look what we're doing with our population. But we still have $9 billion left over from that savings. This is a picture of the city of Detroit. This is another picture of the city of Detroit. Detroit is on the verge of bankruptcy. In fact, it's almost in receivership as we speak. That's the former General Motors headquarters in Detroit. Detroit has closed 50% of its schools because it cannot afford to buy water or sewage or pay its teachers or pay its pensions. Detroit needs a minimum of $35 million a year just to kind of survive. There are 16 cities in the United States that are like that, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It would cost about $9 billion to rescue them. Imagine, we could rescue the 16 most fragile American cities, including Detroit. So that's a nice little fantasy. I would like to give you now a conclusion to this little exercise, and I hope you'll follow this reasoning through. Indeed, the American empire exists, and its tentacles reach across the entire planet. To believe that we are not an empire is to live in denial, to live in a dream, to shut one's eyes to reality, and indeed to our own history. The American empire possesses the world's reserve currency, the American dollar. It influences finance, investment, capital formation, and plays an almost controlling influence on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The United States has enough power to sanction entire countries as disparate as North Korea, Burma, or Iran, freeze their assets, forbid transactions with them, and even punish countries who violate our rules. Greece used to buy Iranian oil, but the U.S. politely asked it to stop. If Greece refuses, the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank will not loan Greece the money it needs. Greece has no choice in the matter. American leverage is king. The American empire is king. We lay out the conditions, set the terms, and define the parameters. Our military might exceeds all other countries on Earth, and 1,000 military bases monitor, police, and patrol the Earth's oceans, supply routes, and most of its trade. We have bases in the middle of the Indian Ocean, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific, hundreds of miles from anywhere. Why? To patrol and police all of the oceans of the world, perhaps, or to be able to send long-range bombers anywhere in the world. The U.S. military, the American empire, has a central command known as the CENTCOM, which has divided up the entire planet into areas of responsibility. Each subdivision responsible for Asia or Africa, as in USA Africa Com, or South America, as in USA South Com. Can you imagine that we have a military command for the entire continent of Africa? Correction. We have a military command assigned to every area of the planet except Antarctica. What other country in the world does this? Our great military adventure consumes almost 60% of our entire federal budget in its increasing efforts to achieve hegemony, empire, and dominance on Earth. But 90% of the American people do not want an empire. So what if? What if we just stopped? What if Diego Garcia was closed? What if we stopped policing the Indian Ocean? What if we closed our central command for Africa? What if we just went back to just being a single country that defended itself and took care of its own people? Just 6% of the planet's surface and 4.5% of the planet's population. That's all. To mothball 9 of our 11 naval armadas. To repatriate 500,000 Americans occupying those 1,000 military bases. To close down our central commands over every continent of the planet. And while we're at it, let's return Guantanamo to Cuba. After all, the first president of Cuba was installed by the United States of America in 1903. And one of his first acts of office was to sign over Guantanamo to us in perpetuity. He was an American. He was from New York City. As John Stossel would say, give me a break. In 1964, President Johnson said that an American ship was attacked in international waters by North Vietnam. This so enraged Congress, it authorized the president to begin the Vietnam War. Years later, when the Pentagon Papers were published, we learned the American ship was inside North Vietnamese territorial waters. Huge American secret we didn't want to get out. The entire legal basis authorizing the Vietnam War was based on a lie. When George Bush Sr. tweaked the heartstrings of Congress with the story that Saddam Hussein was throwing babies out of incubators, he similarly got authorization from Congress to go to war on the basis of this public relations stunt. He killed 138,000 people on the wings of this lie. each time telling the American people we were fighting for liberty and justice, when in fact we were fighting to regain control over 1/5 of the world's oil and trying to put back in power an all-male autocracy led by a fat, promiscuous multi-billionaire who got married and divorced on almost a weekly basis. Finally, his son, George W., tells the American people Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons. Another falsehood, and another 100,000 people who perished. Since World War II, we have helped take the lives of 5 million people in pursuit of our global ambitions, and in the process, our nation has become a lie, a deception, and a hypocrisy. If we free ourselves from this propaganda, abandon our delusions, and peek out from the protective borders of denial, we begin to see reality finally. And what we see in America is not what we were taught, not what we believe in, and no longer representative of our values and aspirations. It is time for a genuine shift in paradigm, a new consciousness, not based on propaganda, deception, delusion, denial, but one based upon awareness and humanity. What if the Occupy Wall Street movement finally got its agenda clarified and defined, and demanded that we reorganize our priorities, dismantle the empire, and return to our own country and our own people, instead of aiding and abetting the ambitions of the richest 1%? It is the 1% who want to see the empire expand and flourish, not for the benefit of the world, not for our benefit, but for their own aggrandizement. This is a picture of a stadium holding 57,000 people. Imagine the richest 57,000 Americans sitting in that stadium. Now that's not the top 1%. That's like 1/6 of the top 1%. These are the 57,000 richest fat cats in American society. Altogether, they possess $7.8 trillion in net worth. Now, I don't know if you can see that little circle there, but that's where the 6 heirs of the Walton family are sitting. These 6 people who have inherited the Walmart fortune, they are worth more than 100 million Americans. They have more cash in their mattresses, stocks, bonds, real estate, and in the Cayman Islands than 100 million Americans. Now, these 57,000 wealthiest Americans have more money than the entire domestic product, the gross domestic product of South America plus Africa plus Australia. That means that those 57,000 people could buy everything that South America, Africa, and Australia produced in a single given year. All the cars, all the services, all the computers, all the food. Currently, some 53% of recent American college graduates are either unemployed or employed in a job that does not require a college education. Think Starbucks. There is a deep vein of discontent within the United States about the fundamental paradigm and direction this country is taking. 40 million poor in the United States, 45 million on food stamps, middle class incomes falling 4% in the same period of time that the number of millionaires has increased 20%. Awakening from our delusions and lifting the veil of denial, it is actually possible to change all that. By dismantling the empire, we could completely end homelessness in 2 years. We could completely eliminate extreme poverty in the United States. We could cut the total poverty rate by 70%. We could provide every American student a free college education, and all for the price of putting an end to the appetites of the gargantuan military colossus and superpower that we have become. It is possible to retreat from empire, from hegemony, and actualize the vision and ideals that lie suppressed inside the heart and soul of America. And it is all within our reach. Thanks for watching.